Welcome to this final session for today's Data Summit Connect Fall 2020. I'm Mary D. Ojala. I'm the Conference Program Director for Data Summit Connect and wanted to welcome all of you to this session on drilling down on database licensing. Something that I'm always very interested in. I hope the rest of you are. So our speakers today are Michael Corey, who is the co-founder of License Fortress, and Don Sullivan, who is system engineer database specialist with VMware. They're going to have many exciting things to tell us. If you have questions during their talk, do put those into the Q&A box. You can see the little icon down at the bottom of your screen. And let's see, what else? Thank you to Sumo Logic, who is our diamond sponsor for Data Summit Connect. And I think we can now turn this over to Michael and to Don. So you want to unmute and start your videos, share your screen, and all that good stuff.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining Don and I today. We are going to talk about drilling down in database licensing, best practices and pitfalls. And Don, would you be so kind? It's not going to let me change the joys of, there we go. Oh, would you be so kind as to introducing yourself?
Yeah, we used an old title for me, bringing back the good old days at first, but I am presently the product line marketing manager for all business critical applications with VMware and the cloud services business unit. Even though I have a broad focus on all critical applications, my core competency is in Oracle. I spent 7 years at Oracle myself, been at 11 years now at VMware. You can notice the white hairs, a little different than even my picture. I spent a lot of time with Oracle. I'm an Oracle certified master. I'm also, for full disclosure, on Mike's and License Fortress's advisory board. So thank you all for joining us, and we'd love to talk to you about this overall situation with database licensing. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Don, I just want you to know I'm a real fan of the article that you write for Big Data Quarterly.
That's an awesome article there, Michael. It's a good thing a couple of us decided to do that a few years ago.
So I'm from License Fortress. You've got my blog up there. I'm an Oracle old timer. I realize at this point I've been working on Oracle for 38 years, started with Oracle version 3. I'm the original Oracle Press author. I've got a list of the titles. I've been very active in the Oracle community over the years. I am an Oracle ace today, a past Microsoft MVP. And I co-write that article with Dawn in the Big Data Quarterly, and I'm also a VMware vExpert. And for purposes of this presentation, we're going to use the framework of looking at licensing from an Oracle perspective. And I'm doing that for a selfish reason, in the sense that my whole company today that I co-founded, License Fortress, focuses on Oracle license compliance management. And so I can give you lots of Oracle examples. I think the examples will apply to almost any major software vendor. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, whether you're a Microsoft customer, an Oracle customer, an SAP customer. And then just a little bit about License Fortress. We offer the first financial and legal guarantee in the industry, which is if we give you advice, it's found wrong at the highest level of the service, we would pay the bill to defend it. And more importantly, we would pay for the licenses that you would have to buy. We do real-time monitoring and alerting, audit defense, training, you say it. We're in the business, so we know a lot about this business.
So let me just add on to that, Mike, that I'm obviously a huge fan. I wrote a book on it, of Oracle running on VMware technologies in general. We at VMware are very committed to making sure that all of our customers completely pay Oracle and VMware everything, every dime that they need to, but we want to see that completely optimized. We want you customers out there to really get as much out of your Oracle dollar as possible. And over the years, a cottage industry has been created around that particular concept. And honestly, there is no better company that exists to help you with that than License 14. Yes, we have a 2020 Sounds of the Time with both
Yes, this
Michael
is
and
called The
myself.
Joys of Working from Home. And so I think you bring up a really good point, which is the idea here is to make sure that you pay what you're supposed to pay, but not overpay. And we'll show you why overcharging is rampant in the industry. We'll prove that point. And so the point of this slide is that the world we live in today is really about silos, right? You've got the Amazon Web Services silo, the Microsoft Azure silo, the Google silo, the private cloud silo. And in fact, if you were to map your organization today and you were to figure out where you are, you would probably look a lot like this diagram I've just put in front of you, right? You would find out that you're in the cloud, you're in a private cloud, you're on-prem, you're off-prem, right? And in fact, the question really companies should be asking is your software still in compliance? And how do you know? Right? And I will tell you that companies had a hard enough time managing their environments when they're on-prem. It's just gotten worse.
So I'm a baseball guy, and you'll always hear baseball analogies from me. And this is October, so I want to even get more into those baseball analogies. What I'm going to tell you all is you don't go up to face major league pitching without major league hitters. And you really have to know what you're doing to understand the nuances and details and pitfalls, as is the subject of this discussion, regarding your database licensing, or you can get in a lot of trouble. You don't want to be facing Clayton Kershaw unless you've got a really good hitter.
And so one of the trends we see is that software is available at the click of a mouse, right? We expect that trend to continue, but it complicates license management. And what people need to forget is if somebody in your environment downloads software and activates it, your organization is responsible for paying the bill.
Whoops.
Right? And so a simple download by anybody anywhere in your infrastructure can mean a very expensive bill. And so one of the best practices is you've got to be looking for rogue software installs. And you really need to be understanding what they are turning on, because as anyone knows who works with Oracle, some features are very expensive. And if you accidentally turn on one of those features, it's going to be a very expensive bill when it happens.
I think that's the key word, Mike. Accidental, even more than rogue. Rogue sort of, implies that there's been some nefarious behavior which can happen, but it's mostly accidental. But regardless, you're still just as responsible.
Right. And the second thing that people forget is that if you outsource your management to some third-party vendor and their people download software and activate it, your organization is still responsible. And people too often, they outsource their database management, they outsource, and they forget the fact that they're still paying the bill because it's their software. And I use an example from License Fortress of a large healthcare connector in one of the 50 states that outsourced their IT, and that vendor created a $15 million liability. Now, we did get involved and we were able to get that down to about $5 million, but then they went after the vendor, and the vendor ended up paying $1 million. And so if you have a best practice of looking for these installs, you won't get surprised, right? You have to have a plan. The second thing is that we've seen Oracle version upgrades turning on software features that require payment. We've seen third-party vendor software upgrades turning on features that require payment. And so you can be doing everything right, and one day you install a software patch that's a security patch and not realize that it turned on something you had to pay for.
So like Mike, how would you take an extremely expensive feature like Oracle partitioning and turn it off forever to make sure it's never used?
So that brings up an interesting point. It really depends on the vendor software. Some vendors make it easy to turn off features or disable them. So
or just not use them. Yeah. I mean, the truth is you really can't ever turn it off completely in the database because partitioning is used in the data dictionary. So it's on. And unless your vendor actually, as Mike just said, doesn't use it and lets you know very explicitly everything you're using, you might be caught.
Well, we've seen customers who are doing backup strategies, not realizing that when they went over to that backup device to back up their databases, it was using features that had to be licensed and paid for. And so you have lots of choices on how you do things. But the most important point that I think Dawn and I are trying to make here is you got to have a plan, and you got to have software that's looking for it, because in the case of Oracle, we'll pick on Oracle, you don't need license keys. Some vendors require license keys, which make it a little harder.
Wow, when I did my Sybase thesis in 1996, you needed a 26-letter key. But Oracle's decided anybody can use anything. We'll come ask you for the money later.
So important point, we had a vendor, and I said they got a patch from Oracle that turned on features. They got audited 2 years later, Oracle's looking for a big bill. And so once again, right, the major pitfall is the bomb keeps ticking until you discover it and deal with it. And in fact, Don, don't you remember Oracle just said they're going to stop selling, 1-year licenses?
No, I didn't know. I really didn't know that. Oh.
Yes. So in the case of Oracle, it used to be you'd find you made a mistake. You could buy a one-time license that was good for 12 months, pay them their due, but not have to keep paying for it. They're slowly doing away. You can still buy them, but officially they're doing away with it. So you're losing
why that stock keeps going up, right?
Yep. The other thing is training, right? You got to train your people. So a big thing we saw is Oracle ULA. Oracle's an unlimited license agreement. It's a very common way that Oracle sells its software. It's especially a common tact to say use an Oracle ULA as a way to get out of an audit problem, right? And there's different issues about that we can talk about. And all your staff heard was you have an unlimited license agreement. But Don, you know a lot about ULAs, right? Oracle ULA doesn't mean unlimited everything, does it?
It's the spider coming to the web. Yep. It means that you can use anything, and you should use anything, and you've paid for something up front, but there will eventually be a true up, and you will actually have to pay for what you actually have used.
Yes, and the other thing people don't realize is that ULAs are very specific to regions. They're very specific to product sets. And just because you have an Oracle ULA that covers XYZ, they can still audit you for other things in your environment. And so even if you have an Oracle ULA, getting out of it you really need to have a plan, right? You have to have a plan so that you get the best use of it if that's a strategy your organization is going to use. And so what we would tell you is, I call it the dinosaur approach. There are still people selling license compliance the old-fashioned way, where they say, hey, it's like a financial audit, you do it once a year. Well, if you turn something on in January and you don't detect it till next December, and Oracle audits you, you have a very expensive bill. If you turn something on January 1st, you detect it, you shut it off a few days later, you get audited a year later, it's a very different outcome. And in fact, vMotion, how often, doesn't VMware now have options where it'll self-tune VMware by moving things around automatically?
Yes, distributed resource scheduler is designed. That's exactly what it does. In fact, it's proactive. So it will not only, or HA is proactive, it'll detect proactive HA will detect a potential failure. And even if you don't know it, move those VMs, possibly running those Oracle instances, to available nodes in the cluster. And if you hadn't intended on and planned for licensing those, well, you might have to go back and replan. And same thing as Mike just mentioned with DRS, it's been around for a long time, but it will move the various different VMs throughout the cluster with the intention of load balancing throughout that cluster. So if you had intended on not licensing for Oracle the entire VMware cluster, you have to have properly set the affinity rules in an on-premises cluster to make sure that you don't inadvertently use a node that you hadn't planned on licensing. Otherwise, back to Mike.
And that's a great point, right? Is your staff set up the affinity rules? They think they did everything right. They have a large, complex environment. They missed something, and one day a vMotion happens. Well, if you use something like License Fortress Discovery or a good SAM tool that would have picked that up, right? In the case of License Fortress, we'll pick it up real time. We'll actually alert you as it's happening. You could correct the situation, and if you got audited, it would be a very different outcome.
Right. You can be totally honest about it, explain it to your account executive, and deal with it, as opposed to every other option, which is worse.
My last company did database management, 39 of the 50 states, and we did database management all over the world. Customers would engage us and say how many databases they have. We'd go in the door, and guess what we'd find? They had all these databases they didn't know about. And we usually got an upcharge. It was great, and we got to manage them. The question is, how many organizations really understand the Java? And Don, what happened April 16th, 2019?
Yeah, put me on a spot. Which date are you talking about?
Well, that's the date that Oracle released its Java licenses changed now to the end of time. And in fact, you have to start paying depending on which version of Oracle Java you have.
Yeah, and
so the world of Java now is potentially a hotspot for.
Well, everybody, if you're on listening, I can actually discuss what Mike was discussing. I forgot the date, but Oracle made a specific change to the way Java was licensed, and therefore you're going to have to license a lot more of what was free Java prior to April. And some of you may have noticed that this week a very large litigation between Oracle and Google has just been before the Supreme Court. And so 10 years ago, Oracle asked for $10 billion to solve that particular issue. The issue, of course, is that in Androids that Java has been used, the licensed version of Java, and Google believes it's a fair use doctrine usage, but Oracle does not. I'm obviously way oversimplifying it, and we'll see what happens. The point being that Oracle is very, very serious about monetizing Java itself. Mike, you back with us?
Yes, and the joys of COVID-19 and working
2020, man. Keep it going.
And so I knew Dawn.
There we go. How about that? I hit it.
You absolutely nailed it. And the more important point is Oracle wins this case. I will tell you, they're going to come out with a vengeance for Oracle Java audits.
Yep.
So get prepared. The good news is if you do it proactively, you have lots of options. And I also it's a shame I didn't get to the slide because this slide was put just for you to talk about something that's going on.
Well, I will. Let me talk about it. Back in September of last year, what I refer to as the miracle at Moscone, that VMware and Oracle announced in fact, it was Larry Ellison himself on stage in front of 5,000 people when we were actually allowed to have real events. Larry announced a strategic alliance between Oracle and VMware. That really comprised of two things: an executive agreement on mutual support, which effectively said, although there's an addendum coming out that is being negotiated at the moment, it effectively said that, as we've known for 13 years, but that Oracle and VMware would totally support each other. Oracle was supported on VMware technologies. Please read, I think Mike's got it listed down here, but MetaLink note or My Oracle support note 249212.1. You can email me if you want that as well, but that we would support each other. Oracle has been supported running on vSphere since 2007 with the single upgrade to Oracle RAC in November of 2010 for 11.202, but it was a bit loose in the sense that it wasn't an executive agreement between the executives of both companies as what happened in September of 2019. The other part of it is that Oracle became a VMware Cloud provider partner, and the Oracle Cloud VMware solution, which is the Oracle VMware Cloud Foundation software, the software-defined data center, and an image, is now running on Oracle Public Cloud or the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, OCI. So you can go and buy. In fact, there are customers now that are running their systems on Oracle Cloud VMware Solution OCVS, which is an Oracle product that, of course, they sell as a partnership with us at VMware. So go ahead, Mike.
And by the way, before I forget, do you know what the airport code is for the airport closest to Oracle corporate headquarters?
Do 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 do. I think it's SQL, Michael.
It is
What
San
is
Quentin
SQL?
Airport. You can't make this stuff up. All right, and so what we really know is that enterprise software goal is to generate more revenues, right? And the world is changing to the cloud, and they're all going to start experimenting with changing their licensing models to generate more revenue. And in fact, they are, right? And in fact, companies have, to VMware's credit, they had a licensing model they tried that people didn't really like. They were really good as a vendor. They backed away. But the bigger issue is people are expecting their DBAs and the system admins to be license experts. That is an absolute mistake because these metrics are constantly evolving. And to be honest, we have a full-time job trying to keep up with it all. And so the goal here is you as a customer want to save money, and the vendor goal here is that you want to protect your revenue stream, and they all have policies. IBM's got the all and nothing, Microsoft's got the software assurance. And do you want to comment on the Oracle support policy, Dean?
So I kind of got into it a little bit before, but it is Metalink Note 249.212.1, and Oracle software is supported running on VMware technologies, has been since 2007. Again, that only changed to that note. It not only is Metalink changed to myOracleSupport.com, but that Oracle RAC 11202 was added in November of 2010. And then in 2019, in September, the executive agreement to support each other was signed on the highest levels, and Larry Ellison announced it at Open World.
Yeah, I meant something different. So what Oracle does is if you decide to get rid of something that's part of a bundling of a CSI, Oracle, through its repricing policy, reserves the right to reprice the remaining software at list price. And so it makes it really difficult for Oracle customers to downsize their licensing footprint without triggering this support valuation. And so this is an example or a strategy that Oracle uses to customers to keep customers at a certain support level.
Sorry, I got out of track there, Mike. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you have to be extremely careful of your situation, because it's particularly with VMware, when people are intending on consolidating, they have to realize that it's possible that their whole their whole support situation from a perspective of the economics could change. So go ahead.
The only good news is you could drop half your Oracle products, but you would still be paying, let's say you had 50 products, you drop 25. You would never pay more than what you were paying before, but you'd have half as many products.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the statements that I made earlier was that overcharging is rampant in the industry, right? The average customer in this software industry is overcharged. And a lot of the factors are increased complexity around cloud offerings, the FUD determining what you really should license versus what you're required to license. And in fact, I love this quote: "We were over licensed and struggling under the burden of high support costs. And in addition, we were not getting our critical maintenance issues resolved." And so overcharging is rampant. And in fact, I wanted to talk about the fact that Larry Ellison made a statement that he would make Oracle Cloud cheaper than anyone else. And by the way, that's Larry Ellison music. I was trying to think of what made good Larry Ellison music. And do you remember what he did? Do you remember what Larry did?
Yeah, he made it more expensive for everybody else.
Yeah, he basically created a just to shut off the music, he basically said if you use hyper-threading, you pay twice as much. In essence, doubling the price of every other cloud.
So
The
he kept his
problem is,
promise. Yeah.
and how fast is a hyper-thread compared to a regular thread typically?
You get
Do
about
remember?
25% uptick in terms of performance bonus in general.
25% uptick, and you pay twice as much. Not a good deal. The other thing is that Larry did this through an Oracle policy statement. And it's really important to understand the difference between policy and contract. Oracle can change a policy overnight without notifying you. So you got to be really careful here. And in fact, during an audit, Gartner Research made the point, our experience suggests that Oracle's interpreting the policy as if it were a contractual obligation from a pricing and compliance perspective. So let's show you an example of that. Under Oracle policy, I call it Galaxy licensing. If you had a 5-node system, node A through E, and you asked Oracle the proper way to license it, or you looked at their policy statement, right, you would be told very conservatively that you owe them $1.9 million. I call that Galaxy licensing. If it's in the Galaxy, you should pay for it. Under your contractual obligation, it's where it's installed and or running, is $380,000. Is this relevant to a VMware customer?
This is everything to a VMware customer. This is how the entire cottage industry got created. And to be honest, this is the foundation of License Fortress.
And so the customer's contractual obligation was $380,000, not including maintenance, not including extra features. And Oracle's audit would come out with 1.9 million. Because if you follow that policy, you will be paying more than you're contractually obligated to, right? And recently, Oracle just released a new disaster recovery policy. Now, in this policy, there's this famous, what we call the 10-day rule, right? So do you remember the 10-day rule, Dawn?
I remember it very, very well. And
can you explain how it typically worked?
The notion is that you can have one server set aside for the purpose of testing backups or having a disaster occur so that you can fail over everything that you've got to that single designated server. So in other words, if you've got an Oracle rack environment in which you have 4 separate servers running, you can only have one. And for that one server, and again, that interestingly, that server can be as large as you want. It can have a lot more processors and all on it, but it can only be one server, and you can only use it for 10 days. And if you use it for 5 minutes in a day because you just did a quick test, that's considered 1 day in a calendar year. If you go beyond that time frame, then you have to start licensing that server as if it was a I always called DR service production, but if it was a server that needed to be totally licensed.
And so in the old 10-day rule, if you started at 11:58 p.m. and you ran into the second day 3 minutes later, that would count as 2 days. Under the new policy statement, Oracle saying a day is a 24-hour period. So this is a positive. I'm not saying this is not a good thing. The problem here, and this is really important point, people, is you can't go into an Oracle policy statement and pick and choose the elements of the policy you like. So you really need to understand the entire pros and cons of the policy. The second thing is the use of a policy could impact your contractual rights and how they're interpreted up the road. And so even though Oracle's extending you this right, and it seems positive, you really need to weigh all the pros and cons of using this policy statement in its entirety versus what it could mean to your contract long-term. And so you really should involve legal counsel, which is kind of baked into the License Fortress service. We actually have an exclusive arrangement with the lawyers that dealt with the Mars Candy Bar case, a very famous case against Oracle. But you really have to understand. And by the way, Oracle can change its policy. Remember that Larry Ellison sound, the music? Oracle announced it'd make Oracle Cloud cheaper than anyone else. They just announced it. They could just make a new announcement and change it. And you better have a plan.
Mike, I'd just like to add something to the terminology, and it fits with this slide perfectly, is that when you see a policy statement, what it might be giving you is privileges. What you have in a contract is a right. It is something you've purchased and you own. And privileges can be taken away or granted at the discretion of whoever is granting or taking away the privileges. And that's where that major league hitting comes in. You really need to, as Mike just described, understand completely what you're doing. And so you need professional help in that regard. Go ahead,
You
Mike.
nailed it. That's a great explanation.
Mhm.
And so then the other thing I always say to people is go out to the policy statement. The deck will be available and it will tell you it's for educational purposes and can't be incorporated into a contract. So why would you pay $1.9 million for something that's for educational purposes and can't be incorporated into your contract? But many customers do. And so you really have to understand your contract and what it means. Process should be defined as all process where Oracle's installed in there running. So if it's running a node A and node B, and it's never been on the other node, you shouldn't have to pay for it. But more important point I want to make is nowhere in your contract is the word virtualization in that Oracle contract.
I've read it
So
many
you as the
times.
customer,
Keep looking
go
for
ahead.
it. Sorry, Mike. I've read it many times. Keep looking for it. It's just not there.
So you as the customer decide how you control what Oracle software is installed and or running. Don't let the policy statement decide that. And the other thing is they love to put URLs linked into their contracts, and vendors do this. So the processor table is a really important table. Wouldn't you say that, Dawn?
It's extremely important. It differentiates between the type of processor that you're running on, the amount that you have to pay for a Spark processor versus an x86 processor versus a RISC processor is extremely different, and they do have the ability to change those costs for new contracts that are signed. If you have already had a contract, then the prices that the core processor table has set will be valid for the lifetime of your contract.
And he makes a great point. The problem is too often customers forget to print this off and save it so they have proof. And in fact, in 2017, we tracked 3 changes.
Wow.
The other trend is we're moving towards buying by the drink. And I'm going to speed up just a little bit because I lost some time and I want to make sure we have a lot of really good slides here. And basically, Gartner, I've been saying this, Dawn and I have been saying this, God, for about 10 years. Gartner finally agreed with us that consumption-based processing is emerging, right? So let's assume people like this buying by the drink because it's cheaper, more flexible, no upfront costs. And in fact, we keep hearing from AWS how public clouds are services keep falling in price year after year. We keep hearing reduction in AWS Cloud Pricing made on 50 separate occasions since launch in 2008, once a quarter over a 7-year period. And in fact, if you went to the AW conference, you would see Jaffrey and he would say at Amazon, every business we run is high volume, low margin business. So Don, when you hear low margin business, what do you think for percentage rates?
I think a New Jersey diner where you better have 1,000 customers to make a couple of $100.
Sure.
Gosh,
So your supermarket, 5-10%. Would that seem reasonable?
Yeah. Even less in some cases. Yeah.
So this video is available. You can go to exactly where I said it, where we get him saying at Amazon, every business we run is high volume, low margin business. And so somebody actually took the time to calculate it, and they estimated at their costs, and they were not a fraction of the size of Amazon without their buying power, that they had over 80% profit margin.
That's how somebody's becoming
low margin.
That's how somebody's becoming a trillionaire, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we now have an indication of fake news, a real fake news. I love that picture. I think it's so freaking funny. And so the other thing is the trend that we expect to see happening, and COVID is accelerating it, is audits are going to increase in velocity, all right, and are going to get more expensive. It's documented by Gartner. It's documented by the patent lawyers. Software vendors are increasing license audits. 75% of software vendors believe their software is being overused in violation. All right. Information World, Software Audits, High Tech Plays, Hardball, Gartner Research, great quote, vendor opposed, revenue motivated audits are increasing, right? There's Larry Ellison with the smug face. Let's do an audit. Bet they are out of compliance. Oracle's got its playbook, which we'll talk about, the audit bargain close. In 2018, an astonishing 75% of small organizations under 1,500 people reported between 1 to 3 audits in the past 3 years. And I'm telling you now, COVID, because audits are about revenue, not compliancy, COVID is going to accelerate the pace of audits. We saw it in the recession, and we're starting to see it now.
Well, automation accelerates that, right? It's easier. One of the only reason you don't get audited every month is because it's expensive. Under the circumstances that automation has been more embedded in the overall system, it's going to be less expensive to audit, therefore more valuable. It's that simple.
But it's about revenue, and that's what people need to understand. And so this is such an important point that people don't get it. This is US law. Licensee has the burden of proof. What does that mean? That means that when Oracle chooses to audit you, Microsoft chooses to audit you, SAP chooses to audit you, you have to prove you own the license and that you're using it in accordance to the license terms. The burden of proof is on you, not on them. And they know that, which makes audits an easy revenue producer. And I just love this slide, right? How strongly do you agree or disagree with the following statements? I don't think my company would pass all its compliance audits if it happened today. 77%. How strongly do you believe or disagree with the following statement? Having to meet compliance standards and cloud usage inhibits further cloud adoptions. 88%. Who the following is harder to find? A cloud engineer who understands compliance or a unicorn? Harder to find a cloud engineer that understands compliance. In 10 years, we've been doing license compliance checks for over 10 years, Dawn. What percentage of clients do you think we've ever gone into and found they didn't have a compliance issue?
Less than 10.
None.
Well, that was less than 10.
You're right, none. So let me say it a little differently. You have a compliance issue. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, Oracle knows those are the odds and they're going to audit you. And the other vendors know this too. And so what I say to people all the time is don't go into a gunfight with a knife. A man who is his own lawyer has a fool for a client. The vendors all have a playbook. They do this all the time. They know it. And so Oracle's playbook is really easy. Audit, bargain, close. Audit you, throw a huge number at you, throw a bargain, close. We had a customer we just dealt with. They were implied that they had an $80-something million compliance issue. Oracle was being kind. They offered them an $8 million solution. They decided to get a second opinion. We went in, we said, you owe Oracle about $500,000 based on your contract. And that happens all the time. We had a small manufacturing company, less than $20,000 a year in annual maintenance with Oracle. They had $1 million compliance issue. And the lawyers, when you ask them about dealing with Oracle and other vendors are just as bad, IBM is just as bad, they're unforgiving, they use ambiguous license terms and confusing constructs. Oracle, this lawyer felt, was the most aggressive audit program of any publisher, and actually Microsoft does far more audits. But the rules are hard to understand. And so the trend is we're going to see more and more audits happening. Did you ever hear of this group called the SIA, Dawn?
No, not until we've talked about it. It's interesting. We need to talk more about it.
So I'm not making this stuff up. License reviews from the Software Investment Advisory. There is a team at Oracle that's here to help you maximize the efficiency, value, and impact of your Oracle organization.
Oh, joy. That's something I'd really make me warm and fuzzy.
And I'm going to quote Reagan, but I'm going to put a little twist. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language here. I'm here from the Oracle. I'm here to help. If SIA looks like a duck, smells like a duck, quacks like a duck, it is a duck. It's an audit.
And it isn't good pate.
So when you get audited, because you will, stop buying software, right? Loose lips sink ships. Stop talking to the vendor, right? You got to have one point of contact. Oracle's got are you familiar with the 45-day advance notice requirement, Dawn?
I certainly am.
Can you just explain what that is?
They have to record. I think in a greater sense, the point is that they're not allowed to disrupt your everyday business. And so they have to give you a certain amount of time. 45 days is arbitrary, but they have to give you a certain amount of time to actually effectively get your house in order and do your own internal analysis before they actually come in to start the actual audit. And the 45 days are 45 business days. And there's a lot of other nuances that you can use to play in your on your behalf. And again, I go back to my point that if you have a professional working for you and helping you along with this, you're much better off, because it's not a good day when you get a notice in the mail from the IRS that they're going to audit you, or from Oracle when they're going to audit you. Oracle might even be worse in some cases.
And so the point here is you do have 45 days, but understand that once you've been notified of an audit, you have a legal obligation to tell them anything that you changed. I'm going to speed up just a little bit to get through the slides. The Oracle audit script, unless you're a new customer, which they've now changed that, the use of the Oracle audit script is not contractual. You don't have to use it. If you do run it, you really have to be careful that you're not setting a contractual obligation to run it in the future. The audit is about revenue. Get professional help. I don't care if it's License Fortress or somebody else, but get people that know how to deal with it. When you deal with an ULA, an Oracle Unlicensed Agreement, right, you have a big deal. And so we've got some suggestions here, but I'll let you look at the deck later. I'm really sorry, people. Losing that gap in the middle threw off my timing. Whatever you do,
don't worry, Mike, just going.
Okay, whatever you do, get a SAM tool in place. I would tell you it should be License Fortress, right? Because we think we have the best damn SAM tool in the world when it comes to Oracle. But get a tool in place, right, that's looking for, and I use the term rogue, but I think, Dawn, how did you say it? Accidental?
Yeah, I think that's a much more prevalent probability that you will have accidental problems, that some database administrator that happened to have sysdba access accidentally creates a partition table because he wanted to see if a particular text worked, and he accidentally did it, or she accidentally did it in a production system, and then bingo, you are responsible for paying for partitioning from there on out for your entire production system. And I am not exaggerating.
Yeah. Make sure you have your copy of your contracts. It's very common that customers don't have contracts, right? But you really have to understand your utilization, because maybe you have an opportunity. There are points in time where you can get access, you can get credits for shelfware, right? Oracle's great software. As long as you fully utilize it, you get great value. But when you're negotiating an ULA, you can get price protections, right? The other thing is there are third-party alternatives to Oracle support, depending on the situation, might make sense for you. And so there's a whole bunch of best practices here that I think are self-explanatory, right? Timing matters. When you buy Oracle software, there are good times to buy it and bad times to buy it. But most important thing, when you get audited by Oracle or any vendor, don't panic. Get help from a license expert. Negotiate the scope of the audit, right? Just because they ask for things that frankly they don't need. That's classic, right? Use of the vendor's audit scripts may not be contractual, right? If you do an ULA, understand where your business is headed, because there are things you can put into the unlimited license agreement that make a big difference. This is
Mike,
a guide.
can I add one point into there that's really important, that mostly what we're focusing on here is the database management system. But of course, there are 300 applications, and the great majority of them have been acquired. If you have license agreements from prior to an acquisition, old legacy license agreements, chances are that they very, very much are in your favor. And chances are that Oracle is going to try to buy them back from you in one form or another. And it's very unlikely that it's really going to be to your advantage. So again, I implore you to get professional assistance to do the analysis before you give up those very valuable legacy licenses. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh my God, Don, that is such a great point, right? Which is you have, if you have an old contract, you have really good rights that are reasonable. Don't be so quick to sign a new license agreement and give up things that you have. I think that is such an important point. I'm so glad you said it. This is a licensing guide that we put out. It's free. You can download it. I think that it's got lots of good, useful information. But I think the point that Don's making and I'm making is it's an evolving place. Policies are coming out all the time. The rules are changing. The licensing metrics are changing. The vendors' rules are confusing. The risks are organization. Can you imagine being part of an organization that gets hit with an $88 million bill? Weren't prepared. And the most important thing is that you can correct these things before an audit and do it the right way so that when you get audited, you won't have these problems. We have a survey out there. We decided to start getting a sense of how often are people getting audited. So if you have a chance, we don't ask you for your company name. We don't ask anything personal. Please click on the link and just check off the survey, all that apply by any means. This is our email addresses, and we will attempt with the time that we have left to the questions.
All right. Well, thank you for that whirlwind tour of licensing. I did have a question. As you were talking about contracts and the URLs in the contracts, you were talking about that specifically with Oracle, but do you find that every company has that in their contracts? Is that so common that everybody should really go through, look for those URLs and print them out?
So Dawn I think Dawn, you nailed this, right? And I think Dawn, to quote Dawn's words, right? Print it out, because those are when you sign the contract, that's what you're obligated to, period.
Are they in everybody's contract? Is that
It's very
All
common.
vendors,
common?
it's very common. Yes.
Okay.
And
Yes.
print them out at the time you sign the contract, because unless you have proof, you really might be stuck with whatever it is that those values are at the time that the audit occurs.
And the other thing that's important here, and this is what people don't realize, so how License Fortress is a little unique is you have license experts that are out there. They understand licensing. They're very good. Okay. But do they understand that a hyperthread, as Dawn said, is 25% in performance, and that when you pay twice as much for hyperthread, it doesn't make any sense? Do they understand that you bought the Enterprise Edition of Oracle 10 years ago because you needed all that functionality, but due to the new advances in hardware and chips, maybe you could go to the standard edition. So we're going from $179,000 a core to $17,000 a core. So you got to have the technology piece, especially in today's cloud world. Then you got to have the legal piece, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I see this policy, it looks good, I want to take advantage of it, but oh my God, am I setting a precedent that may bite me 5 years later? Make no mistakes, the vendors are setting you up for those precedents. And so you got to have, right, the legal aspect of it.
Yeah.
You got to have the contractual aspect, you got to have the technical aspect, and it's three pieces that work together. But then you got to have a SAM tool. SAM tools have been around for a long time. The problem I have with other SAM vendors, right? This is me on my high horse. They tell you what your inventory is, but they won't answer the question, am I properly licensed?
Oh,
Well,
great.
guess what?
So
Okay,
software asset
shot.
management, because he didn't actually list out the acronym.
Right. So I got shot.
Done.
I know I need medical treatment, but what do I need? Can I throw a Band-Aid on it? And so they weren't really solving the problem. So I think you need a good SAM tool, but you need all the other pieces. So we put it all under one roof. And then because we had all the pieces, we offered a financial guarantee, which nobody else in the industry is willing.
And he's not using the word, so I will. Indemnification. In other words, the customer's problem becomes License Fortress's problem if it happens.
And by the way, they become happier customers because I love Oracle's technology. It's the best in the industry. It works. It scales. What I don't like is the being overcharged, right?
Well,
As
yeah.
a US citizen, I'm okay with paying taxes, but don't tell me the billionaire paid $200 in taxes. Right? I understand that my nation needs money to fund our support. So I just don't want to overpay.
Hey, Mike, I think it was 700. Let's be honest.
Sorry.
Let's
My
not
high
go
horse.
there. We do have a question that has come in through the Q&A panel here. What price ranges do you see for the policies, license, and registration permits? I would imagine that those are pretty broad, depending on what you're looking at.
So say that again.
Price ranges for policies, license, and registration permits.
You mean for the software or for the license management tool?
Greg,
do
do
you
you want
think?
to, the person who put this question in, you want to clarify that for us?
I mean, obviously Oracle software itself, just as an example, the business intelligence can be $300,000 a core. Oracle RAC is $40,000 a core. It's the most expensive thing in your data center, period.
Here, we've
Right.
unmuted Gregory, so
Yeah.
explain what you meant by that.
Well, like Don's saying, is that is exactly what I wanted. You know, Don and Mike, and yes, this is important. If I want to run or be certified, okay, by the federal and state government, what is your price ranges? You know, for policies, license and registrations. To operate as a administrator.
You mean full license Fortress itself?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Mike.
Okay.
You're going to love this. Ready? So this is me and the co-founder wanted full transparency of pricing. All right. So you can actually go out to a website and we'll tell you. But what we do is we call it t-shirt sizes. Are you a small customer with less than 50 workloads? An Oracle database instance is a workload. That would start around, I think it's $14,000 for a 12-month subscription.
Okay.
Right? And so are you a medium-sized customer, 250 workloads? Are you a large customer, 1,000 workloads? Right? We have customers that are on 6 continents with their deployments.
That's true. That's true.
And so we make it affordable. The other thing is complexity. Are you just Oracle databases? Okay, that's one price. The minute you start it, are you middleware? Okay, well, we add roughly 25% off on the price. Are you Oracle e-business suite? But what I can tell you is I can have a 10-minute conversation and tell you exactly what it would cost you. Fixed price, which is nice.
Okay.
We do a lot of this.
Okay. Well, just send me the website address, okay, and I can learn from there. How about that?
And you're always welcome to call me, but it's licensefortress.com, one word.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Yeah, I didn't get that either, so that was great.
Okay, everything is fine.
Thanks so much. You know, I'd actually like to ask you something that you will not be able to answer definitively, because I'd like your opinion on what you think is going to happen with the Supreme Court case, because it's been going on for 10 years. We have new justices. And it's basically a copyright case when you boil it down to the essentials.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen?
At the risk of probably saying more than I should, and of course we're dealing with 8 justices here. It would be different if we had a 9th and the eight justices heard the case initially. I've listened and I've read the arguments of fair use, and the 11,000 plus modules that are involved in building the 2 billion Android phones that are presently in the market. That was all licensed or licensable software that was used for the most part, at least as far as I understand. And I'm not a Supreme Court lawyer. I have not gone before the Supreme Court 9 times like Ted Cruz has, but it seems relatively obvious to me that they haven't been paying what they should, at least from that perspective. So, Mike, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I hate to say it. I think that Google's going to lose this.
Really?
And because it was very clear what they were doing at the time, and that this country has a precedent of you have a right to charge for your software. I wish they didn't win it, because I think there's long-term issues. So I predict that you're going to see Java audits on a pace we've never seen. Because
Yeah, I think that's going to happen too.
Yeah, and I'm not happy about it.
And I think, Mike, Judge Roberts is going to try to avoid that by trying to encourage a settlement that doesn't look like it is a complete victory on the part of Oracle, for the purpose of avoiding exactly what you just described, chaos in the industry, as they have called it. But it's pretty hard for me to imagine the fact that an idea that you can get away with using licensable software for 10 years on 2 billion phones without ever having to pay anything for it. So
yeah, shame on Google.
Amazing.
And by the way, there were free versions they could have used potentially.
Yeah.
So this is really foolish on their end.
But they got $200 billion in cash, so let's not feel hard for that.
Right. And by the way, this is a really interesting point. If you do a job like we do, we call it Java checkup, we check.
Yeah.
There are lots of options in the industry. Like, as long as you're proactive about it, there are other solutions. So it's one of those cases where you're not locked into Oracle. It's not easy to migrate your Oracle database. It's doable, but not easy. Java, I would argue, you have a lot of better, good options, and you just need time.
On that note, you have given us so much to think about with licensing. I know I've learned a lot, and I appreciate all that. So thank you both so much for this. Thanks to Sumo Logic, who is our diamond sponsor. Come back tomorrow, everybody. We will have day 3 of Data Summit Connect. We will start at 10:30 in the morning Eastern time, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks again to.
Thank you for including us, RD.
Thank you.
Thank you, database, DBTA. So long, everybody.